Kelechi. Ada, are you going to sit there all night? I wasn't ignoring you. I was just resting. Resting? You rest all day. What else do you even do? You don't work. You don't contribute. Your only job is to take care of me, and you can't even do that right. Kelechi, please. I'm pregnant. I'm tired. Can't we just... Don't start with that excuse again. I'm your husband, Ada. I have needs, and it's your job to meet them. Do you understand me? Kelechi, I'm begging you, the baby is fine. Stop acting like you're the first woman to ever get pregnant. You're my wife, and you'll do as I say. Please, Kelechi, I'm not ready. I can't. Enough. This is not up for discussion, Ada. You know what your duties are. Come and satisfy me.
The night was quiet, but for Ada, peace was an illusion. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her swollen belly, and stared blankly at the floor. The faint hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in the room, but it couldn't drown out the storm inside her.
Pregnancy was supposed to be a time of joy, but for Ada, it felt like a burden. Every night brought dread, not just because of the weight of her growing child, but because of the man who claimed to love her. Kelechi, her husband, was a well-respected man in their community. To outsiders, he was charming, successful, and the perfect provider. But to Ada, he was a source of fear and pain. That night, the familiar sound of Kelechi's car pulling into the driveway made her heart race. She instinctively placed a hand on her belly, as though shielding her unborn child from the man they both feared. The door slammed shut, and heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. Ada! Kelechi's voice boomed. Where's my food? In the kitchen, she called back, her voice trembling. She quickly wiped her face and rushed to the dining table, setting his meal before him. As Kelechi sat down to eat, he glanced at Ada. Why are you just standing there? Sit down, he barked. Ada lowered herself into a chair, her body aching from the strain of pregnancy. She avoided his gaze, knowing that any wrong move could set him off. Why is this stew so salty? Kelechi snapped after taking a bite. Do you think I'm a fool? You can't even cook properly, yet you are carrying my child. What kind of mother will you be? Ada swallowed hard, forcing back tears. She wanted to defend herself, to remind him of the challenges she faced every day. Cooking, cleaning, and enduring his temper while carrying their baby had drained her. But she said nothing. Experience had taught her that silence was safer. Later that night, as Ada lay in bed, exhaustion consumed her, but sleep wouldn't come. She knew what was coming. Kelechi entered the room, his expression dark. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Don't give me any excuses tonight, Ada, he said, unbuckling his belt. I'm tired of hearing that you're not feeling well. Kelechi, please, Ada whispered, clutching her belly. I'm pregnant. I'm not strong enough for this, he scoffed, leaning over her. Pregnant or not, you're still my wife. Do you think I care about your excuses? You're mine, Ada, and you'll do what I say. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded. Please, Kelechi, I'm begging you, the baby... But her words fell on deaf ears. Kelechi's pride wouldn't allow him to be refused, not even by the mother of his child. His anger boiled over, and the night turned into a nightmare once again. Ada cried silently, praying for the strength to endure. The next morning, Ada stood in the kitchen, her body sore and her heart heavy. She absent-mindedly rubbed her belly, murmuring words of comfort to her unborn child. Don't worry, my baby. One day we'll be free. One day you won't have to see this. The sound of the front door opening jolted her from her thoughts. Kelechi strode into the kitchen, dressed for work. He barely glanced at her as he grabbed his car keys. I'll be home late, he said, his tone indifferent. Make sure dinner is ready on time. Ada nodded, her voice too weak to reply. As he left, the weight on her chest lifted slightly. She exhaled deeply, cherishing the brief moments of peace while he was away. That afternoon, as Ada sat on the couch, cradling her belly, She thought about the life she wanted for her child. This wasn't it. She wanted her baby to grow up in a home filled with love, not fear. She wanted her child to see her as strong, not broken. The sound of her phone buzzing interrupted her thoughts. It was a message from her neighbor, Amaka. "Ada, I haven't seen you in a while. Is everything okay?" Ada hesitated before replying, "I'm fine, thank you." But even as she sent the message, she knew it wasn't true. Amaka responded almost immediately. "You can talk to me, Ada. I'm here if you need anything." For a moment, Ada considered opening up. She thought about telling Amaka everything. The nights of pain, the fear she lived with, the hopelessness she felt. But fear held her back. What if Kelechi found out? What if people judged her? What if no one believed her? Ada placed the phone down and closed her eyes. She couldn't see a way out, but deep down, she knew something had to change. For her baby's sake, she couldn't continue living like this. As the sun set and the shadows grew longer, Ada braced herself for another night. But this time, a small flicker of determination sparked within her. She didn't know how or when, but she was certain of one thing. This wouldn't be her life forever. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, but it brought no warmth to Ada's heart. She moved slowly around the kitchen, her back aching as she prepared breakfast. The baby had been kicking all night, and coupled with the bruises on her body, she barely managed to get any rest. Still, she pushed through the pain. If Kelechi's meal wasn't ready on time, she knew there would be consequences. The sound of the front door opening jolted her from her thoughts. Kelechi strode into the kitchen, dressed for work. He barely glanced at her as he grabbed his car keys. "What's that smell?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I'm making rice and stew," Ada said softly, avoiding his eyes. Kelechi walked over to the pot and peered inside. "Rice and stew again? Don't you ever cook anything different? Are you trying to bore me to death?" Ada bit her lip, holding back a retort. She had wanted to make something else, but the pantry was nearly empty, and Kelechi refused to give her money for groceries. She had stretched what little they had left to prepare this meal. "It's all we have," she said carefully. "I'll go to the market tomorrow," Kelechi sneered. "You always have an excuse, don't you? Do you think I work this hard so you can feed me scraps?" Ada stayed silent, focusing on the pot in front of her. She stirred the stew slowly, willing herself not to cry. But her silence only seemed to fuel Kelechi's anger. When the food was finally ready, Ada set the table and placed a steaming plate of rice and stew in front of him. She sat across from him, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly. Kelechi took a bite, then immediately spat it out. "What is this?" he shouted, slamming his fork down. "This stew tastes horrible. Did you even try, or were you too lazy to care?" "I'm sorry," Ada whispered, her voice shaking. "I tried my best." "Your best?" Kelechi mocked, his eyes narrowing. "Your best is pathetic." Before Ada could react, Kelechi grabbed the plate and hurled it across the table. The steaming hot rice and stew splattered all over her, staining her dress and scalding her skin. She screamed, the heat searing her chest and arms. "You useless woman!" Kelechi roared. "You can't even cook a decent meal. What good are you?" Ada stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as the pain from the burns mixed with the weight of his words. She clutched her belly, her first instinct to protect the baby. "Please, Kelechi," she begged. "I'm pregnant. Have mercy." "Pregnant?" he scoffed. "You think that excuses you? Don't use that baby as a shield. I'm sick of your excuses." Etta couldn't take it anymore. The pain, the humiliation, the constant fear, it was all too much. She stumbled backward, her legs trembling as she tried to steady herself. "Why are you doing this?" she cried. "What did I ever do to deserve this?" Kelechi stepped closer, towering over her. "You think you can question me? I'm your husband, Ada. You belong to me. Don't ever forget that." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Kelechi left for work without another word, leaving Ada to clean up the mess he had made. She scrubbed the floor, her body aching and her mind racing. She couldn't keep living like this. The baby deserved better. She deserved better. Amaka's words echoed in her mind. You don't have to face this alone. But Ada was terrified. What if Kelechi found out she was confiding in someone? What if he retaliated? The risks were too great. Yet so was the cost of staying silent. That evening, as she sat on the couch, Ada cradled her belly and whispered to her unborn child. I'm sorry, she said, tears falling freely. I'm trying, my baby. I'm trying to be strong for you. The baby kicked in response, and for the first time in months, Ada felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe it was time to take a stand. When Kelechi returned home that night, his mood was as volatile as ever. He barely glanced at Ada as he walked past her into the bedroom. She followed him cautiously, her heart pounding. Kelechi, she began, her voice trembling. We need to talk. He turned to face her, his expression dark. About what? Ada hesitated, fear gripping her. But then she thought of her baby, the life growing inside her, the innocent soul depending on her to make the right choices. I can't keep living like this, she said, her voice gaining strength. You're hurting me, and you're hurting our baby. For a moment, Kelechi looked taken aback. Then his face twisted into a scornful sneer. So now you're blaming me for everything? Typical. Don't forget who puts food on this table, Ada. Without me, you're nothing. Ada's heart sank, but she refused to back down. I'm not nothing, she said, her voice firm. And one day, you'll see that. Kelechi laughed coldly. You? Stand up to me? Don't make me laugh. But as he turned away, Ada felt a surge of determination. She didn't know how or when, but she was going to find a way out. For herself and for her baby. That night, as she lay awake, Ida made a silent promise. This was the beginning of the end. Kelechi's reign of terror was coming to an end, and she would do whatever it took to protect her child. The evening air was heavy with tension, and Ada could feel it pressing down on her chest. She sat in the living room, her hands resting on her swollen belly, trying to calm the storm in her heart. She could hear Kelechi moving around in the bedroom, his heavy footsteps signaling his growing impatience. The baby inside her kicked softly, as if sensing her distress. It's okay, my baby, Ada whispered. Just a little longer. I'll figure out how to protect you. She didn't know how much longer she could endure Kelechi's cruelty. Every day brought a new wound, whether it was his words, his fists, or his unrelenting demands. But tonight, she felt particularly vulnerable. Her body ached, her heart was heavy, and her spirit felt as though it were about to shatter. Ada! Kelechi's voice boomed from the bedroom, snapping her out of her thoughts. Are you going to sit there all night? Ada hesitated, her body frozen with fear. She knew what he wanted, and she knew how it would end. Still, she couldn't ignore him. With a deep breath, she forced herself to her feet and walked slowly to the bedroom. Kelechi was already in bed, his shirt discarded on the floor. He looked at her with a mixture of annoyance and expectation. What took you so long? He demanded. You think you can just ignore me now? I wasn't ignoring you, Ada said softly, her voice trembling. I was just resting. Resting? Kelechi scoffed. You rest all day. What else do? You don't work, you don't contribute. Your only job is to take care of me, and you can't even do that right. Ada's hands instinctively moved to her belly, as though shielding her unborn child from his words. Kelechi, please, she began, her voice cracking. I'm pregnant. I'm tired. Can't we just— Don't start with that excuse again, Kelechi interrupted, his voice rising. I'm your husband, Ada. I have needs, and it's your job to meet them. Do you understand me? Kelechi, I'm begging you, Ada pleaded, tears streaming down her face. The baby is fine, Kelechi snapped, grabbing her arm roughly. Stop acting like you're the first woman to ever get pregnant. You're my wife, and you'll do as I say. Ada tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. She could feel the bruises already forming on her skin. Please, Kelechi, she cried. I'm not ready. I can't. But Kelechi wasn't listening. His pride, his anger, and his twisted sense of entitlement drowned out her pleas. He pulled her onto the bed, his actions forceful and unrelenting. Ada cried silently, her tears soaking the pillow as she endured yet another night of torment. When it was over, Kelechi rolled over and fell asleep almost immediately, his snores filling the room. Ada lay still, her body trembling and her mind racing. Her hand rested on her belly, and she whispered softly to her unborn child. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry you have to feel this. I promise I'll find a way to protect you. I promise. For hours, Ada lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, anger, and desperation. She couldn't continue living like this. Kelechi's actions weren't just hurting her. They were endangering her baby. For hours, Ada lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, anger, and desperation. She couldn't continue living like this. Kelechi's actions weren't just hurting her. They were endangering her baby. The next morning, Ada avoided Kelechi as much as possible. She cooked his breakfast in silence, her hands trembling. She placed the plate on the table. Kelechi barely glanced at her, too busy scrolling through his phone. I'll be working late tonight, he said casually. Don't wait up for me. Ada nodded, her heart pounding. His absence would give her some time to think, to plan. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew she couldn't stay here much longer. As soon as Kelechi left for work, Ada called Amaka. Her voice shook as she spoke. Amaka, I need help. What's wrong, Ada? Amaka asked, her tone filled with concern. I can't talk over the phone, Ada said. Can you come over? When Amaka arrived, Ada broke down, telling her everything. She spoke of the abuse, the sleepless nights, and the fear that consumed her. Amaka listened quietly, her expression growing more and more troubled. Ada, you can't stay here, Amaka said firmly. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the baby. You need to leave. But where would I go? Ada asked, her voice shaking. Kelechi will find me. He'll never let me go. We'll figure something out, Amaka said, placing a reassuring hand on Ada's shoulder. You're not alone in this. For the first time in years, Ada felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let Kelechi destroy her or her child. The chains that had bound her were beginning to crack, and she was determined to break free. Ada woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and an overwhelming sense of dread. The sunlight streaming through the window did nothing to brighten her spirits. She could hear Kelechi in the living room talking loudly on the phone. His voice was harsh, as usual, barking orders at someone on the other end. Ada knew it was only a matter of time before his attention turned to her. She sat up slowly, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly. The baby had been kicking a lot lately, as if urging her to fight back. But every time she thought about leaving, fear paralyzed her. Where would she go? Who would help her? What if Kelechi found her? Her thoughts were interrupted by his voice calling her name. Ada, what are you doing in there? Get out here now! Ada flinched, her heart racing as she hurried to the living room. Kelechi was standing by the dining table, his arms crossed and his face twisted in a scowl. What is this? He demanded, pointing at the empty bottle of water on the table. You can't even refill the water? What kind of lazy woman are you? I'm sorry, Ada said quickly, rushing to grab the bottle. Her hands trembled as she carried it to the kitchen. As she refilled the bottle, Kelechi followed her, his anger building. You're always sorry, he sneered. Sorry doesn't fix anything. You're just useless, Ada. Useless. Ada bit her lip, holding back tears. She had heard those words so many times that they had started to feel true. But deep down, she knew she wasn't useless. She was doing everything she could to survive, for herself and her unborn child. Later that day, Ada was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Kelechi stormed in. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight and painful. "What's taking so long with the food?" he demanded. "I'm almost done," Ada said, her voice shaking. "Just a few more minutes." "A few more minutes?" Kelechi snapped. "You've been in here for hours. Are you trying to starve me?" Before Ada could respond, he grabbed the pot of soup she was stirring and tipped it over, spilling the hot liquid onto the floor. Ada screamed as some of it splashed onto her legs, burning her skin. She stumbled back, tears streaming down her face. "Clean this mess up," Kelechi shouted. "And don't make me wait for my food again." Ada sank to the floor, her body trembling as she tried to wipe up the spilled soup. Her legs throbbed from the burns, and her heart felt as though it might break. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to run, but she didn't have the strength. Not yet. That evening, Kelechi's mood hadn't improved. As they sat at the dining table, he continued to berate her. "Look at you," he said, gesturing to her swollen belly. "You're already fat and now you can't even take care of yourself. What kind of mother will you be?" Ada stayed silent, focusing on the pot in front of her. She stirred the stew slowly, willing herself not to cry. But her silence only seemed to fuel Kelechi's anger. "Answer me when I'm talking to you," he yelled. Ada looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm trying, Kelechi," she said softly. "I'm doing my best." "Your best isn't good enough," he snapped. "You're pathetic." That night, Kelechi's demands were worse than ever. He forced Ada to lie with him, ignoring her pleas for mercy. Her tears and cries meant nothing to him. To Kelechi, she was his property, something to be used and discarded at will. When it was over, Ada lay awake in the darkness, her body aching and her soul shattered. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't let Kelechi destroy her or her baby. She thought about Amaka's offer of help, about the notebook where she had documented every instance of abuse. She thought about the life she wanted for her child, a life free from fear and pain. "Have to leave," Ada whispered to herself. "I have to." The next morning, Ada began to form a plan. She packed a small bag with essentials and hid it in the back of the closet. She slipped her notebook into the bag, knowing it might be her only evidence if she ever needed to prove what Kelechi had done. As she cooked breakfast, she rehearsed what she would say to Amaka. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew she couldn't stay in this house any longer. She had to find a way out, no matter the cost. When Kelechi left for work, Ada called Amaka. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, her heart pounding in her chest. "Amaka," she said when her friend answered. "I need your help." The air in the house felt heavier than ever as Ada waited for Kelechi to leave for work. Her stomach churned with nerves, and her swollen belly felt tight as the baby kicked again. She whispered to herself softly, "It's okay, my baby. Today will be different. Today, I'll take the first step." When Kelechi finally left, slamming the door behind him, Ada felt a small wave of relief. She wasted no time. She grabbed her phone and called Amaka, her voice trembling. "Amaka, please, I need you." Amaka didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, just hold on." Ada hung up and looked around the house she had once dreamed would be her sanctuary. The cracks in the walls and the fading paint mirrored the life she now lived, broken and worn. She felt a pang of sadness, but she quickly shook it off. She had to focus. Amaka arrived as promised, her husband Chike driving the car. Ada opened the door cautiously, glancing down the street to ensure no one was watching. Amaka rushed inside, her face filled with worry. "Ada, what's going on?" Amaka asked, holding her hands. "Are you okay?" Ada's lips quivered as she tried to speak. Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought to keep her composure. "I can't stay here anymore, Amaka. Kelechi, he's getting worse. I'm scared for my baby." Amaka frowned, her expression hardening. "You can't keep living like this. What's the plan?" Ada hesitated. I don't know. I don't have anywhere to go." "You can stay with us," Amaka said firmly. "At least for a while, until you figure things out." "No," Ada said, shaking her head. "If Kelechi finds me at your house, he'll come after you too. I can't risk that." Amaka exchanged a glance with her husband, who had been listening quietly. Chike cleared his throat. "Ida, I know a place. It's a shelter for women who've gone through things like this. It's safe, and Kelechi won't find you there." "A shelter?" Ada asked, her voice uncertain. "It's not forever," Amaka said gently. "But it's a start. You'll be safe, and you can plan your next steps." Ada thought about it for a moment. The idea of leaving everything behind terrified her, but staying wasn't an option. She nodded slowly. "Okay, let's do it." With Amaka and Chike's help, Ada packed a small bag with her essentials, clothes, her notebook documenting the abuse, and a few items for the baby. As they loaded the bag into the car, Ada felt a strange mix of fear and hope. She was finally taking a step toward freedom. Amaka placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Ada. You're brave." Ada smiled weakly, but her mind was racing. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting Kelechi to appear at any moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The drive to the shelter was tense. Ada sat in the back seat, clutching her bag tightly. The streets blurred past her, and she couldn't help but think about Kelechi. What would he do when he came home and found her gone? Would he try to find her? Would he hurt her even worse if he did? "You're safe now," Amaka said, as if reading her thoughts. "The shelter has strict security. No one can get in without permission." When they arrived, Ada was surprised by how welcoming the place looked. It wasn't the cold, impersonal building she had imagined. Instead, it was a modest house with warm, inviting lights and a garden in the front yard. Inside, a kind woman named Mrs. Irity greeted them. "Welcome, Ada," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you or your baby." Ada felt tears streaming down her face as she stepped inside. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. She was safe. For now. Meanwhile, Kelechi returned home that evening, expecting to be greeted by the smell of food and the sight of Ada scurrying around the house. But the house was silent. He called out her name, but there was no response. His brow furrowed as he checked each room, finding them all empty. It wasn't until he noticed the missing bag in the closet that he realized what had happened. Fury bubbled inside him as he grabbed his phone and began dialing Ada's number. It went straight to voicemail. "Where do you think you can hide, Ada?" he muttered to himself. "You can't run from me." At the shelter, Ada sat in a quiet room, her hands resting on her belly. She couldn't stop thinking about Kelechi and what he might do. But as she felt the baby kick softly, she reminded herself why she had taken this step. She had to protect her child, no matter what. Amaka and Chike stayed with her for a while, making sure she was settled before they left. "If you need anything, call us," Amaka said. "We're just a phone call away." "Thank you," Ada whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "You're stronger than you think, Anda," Amaka said, hugging her tightly. "You've taken the hardest step. The rest will come." As the door closed behind them, Ada sat on the small bed, her thoughts racing. She was free from Kelechi's immediate reach, but she knew this was only the beginning. She would have to stay strong, for herself and for the life growing inside her.